Good morning, everybody. My name is Crystal Holloman. I'm a digital reporter here at News 10, and we're going to take you to Howell, where the Livingston County Sheriff's Department is sharing new details in what they say is a major break in an unsolved cold case homicide. We're going to take you down there and hear what they have to say right now.
You know, it's a privilege to be able to stand here and represent this office in all the great work that was done by the men and women of the Sheriff's Office. So, again, she was found in 1983. All the tips, all the information that we had at the time was investigated, and the case ended up going cold. In 2009, then Sheriff Bob Bazat and now State Rep Bazat started this cold case. These were not all the original members on that cold case. Again, some folks have come and gone. But the cold case was started strictly a volunteer group, and volunteers are a unique bunch in the fact that they put in countless hours to be here to do the right thing because of the passion. So hats off to the volunteers. 2022, fast forward, we had some DNA that was in this case that was collected back in 1983. The State Police Crime Lab, for a number of reasons, wasn't able to connect anything. So there's a outfit out there called Season of Justice, and Season of Justice, what they do, their mission basically is to provide financial resources to law enforcement for DNA testing. Having collected the DNA, again back in 1983, having received the grant from Season of Justice, the DNA was sent to a place called Othram Lab in Texas, which is a nationally known company that does DNA genealogy. They were able to provide us a suspect, and through some continued work and frankly cooperation from the suspect's family, which we thank them for, we were able to identify beyond a reasonable doubt the killer of Christina Castiglione. His name is Charles David Shaw, and we'll get to him in just a second. So this is the area where Christina's body was located. The X marks the spot of basically where her body was found. Detective Moore actually was the one that took this picture back in 1983 from an airplane one of our deputies had at the time. This is our suspect. So here's the unfortunate, but I guess maybe fortunate part of this case. The suspect, I mentioned before, Christina was found in March of 1983. The suspect died in November of 1983. There will be no justice from the court system as a result of this, but obviously he'll has answered to a higher power, I'm sure. This is a little bit of a timeline that I mentioned earlier as well. And if you leave us an email address, I'll make sure that you guys and gals get a copy of the PowerPoint. We can send that out. Again, a huge hats off to Season of Justice and Ortham. You know, when there's a homicide, there's normally some sort of a connection between the victim and the suspect, and in this case there was none. That's one of the reasons that this was 40 years in the making. There was no tips, there was no evidence, there was no indication that would lead us to Charles Shaw. In addition, he died himself, 8 months later, 6 months later. So with that, I would bring up our esteemed group here to answer any specific questions of the case. So come on up, fellas. and I'm going to step aside.
I would like to ask the detective who took the picture to step up, please.
Yes, sir.
Please, over to the podium, please. Okay, so 40 years later, what is your thought? What are your reactions to solving this case?
I'm happy we were able to bring a conclusion to the family.
And what was it that drove you to put this much effort into it?
Just because of the fact of the circumstances and how young she was.
But there had to have been, I mean, yes, it mattered to you, but there are many cases like this. For you to expend the energy that you did, what drove you?
Just the job.
Yeah, but you're volunteering.
Still just the job.
Well, and that's what I'm trying to get at, is that there was something inside you that gave you the perseverance to go this far. I just want you to help me understand that.
I don't know that I can, other than the fact that the case was unsolved. And I was part of the group that originally processed the scene and did the interviews.
Are you surprised at the result of the DNA test? Are you
Surprised.
surprised that
No,
it came out the way it did?
I'm happy that it came out the way it did because we were able to bring closure.
In terms of the police work that went into this, you were trying to find somebody that had no connection to her, and there was finally that connection made. What was your reaction when you discovered it was this person?
Again, it was closure. That's no real reaction. Yes,
About
sir.
that person, what are the circumstances around Mr. Shaw's death?
Matt?
So when we got the name, we contacted the Wayne County Medical Examiner's office to get a copy of the death certificate, and it was determined that he died accidentally by sexual asphyxiation.
So in the press release, it mentions that he struggled with gender identity.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that, where that conclusion came from?
So he was married at the time, back in the early 80s, and we had interviewed his wife extensively. And she had spoken with him around 1980, 1981, and he had disclosed to her that at the time he wished to undergo a sex change and was seeking counseling to do so. She also described him as a sexual deviant who had many different things that he would do, I guess is the easiest way to describe it, that she did not approve of. So that was her description of him.
Is she still alive?
She is.
And she cooperated with this investigation?
She did, yeah.
And the cause of death on his death certificate is sexual
Asphyxiation is what it was determined.
So was that like autoerotic asphyxiation? Was this-
Another name for it, yes. And that occurred in Detroit city limits.
Are you able to piece together at all, there was no ties between the two, she's from Redford, and I have not read this for giving summer
Yeah.
festival and others are reading when you get this, but I'm trying to piece together, do you have any idea how they encountered each other? Did he bring her out here, obviously, you know, the circumstances
Right.
of how and when?
So that's kind of a big unknown piece. We know that he resided at the time approximately 5 miles from where she went missing. He was a longtime Livonia resident. He lived in Detroit at some time as well. She went missing, I believe it was 5 Mile Road in Livonia, and his residence, like I said, was within 5 miles from there. He didn't have any ties to the Deerfield Township area. However, he knew Livingston County and had been previously arrested in Livingston County in 1981.
And again, it's probably explained in the release, and I apologize,
Yep.
but the circumstances, time of day, was she in a store? Was this in the evening after leaving a restaurant? I mean, can you give some context in regard to the how and the when she disappeared and how you believe they encountered each other?
I'll let Detective Moore step back up. I'm not familiar with all of that.
She was walking home. It was in the the late afternoon hours, or walking towards home. She was observed by a friend of hers at the time who was passing by in a car. He asked to be dropped off, and then he went to walk towards her and never found her.
Can you talk about kind of the importance of genealogical DNA in this? I was actually a reporter in Fort Wayne when they solved the April Tinsley case using the same process. Can you kind of just talk about this, the importance of this?
So back in the early 2000s, the profile that we had, the DNA profile that was obtained from the DNA in 1983, was entered into CODIS with the Michigan State Crime Lab. Unfortunately, CODIS doesn't work with genealogy. So in 2022, we took that sample and sent it off for analysis by advanced DNA technology to create that profile that's good enough to go into databases to be searched and the genealogy take place. It's a completely different type of DNA profile, so it doesn't work with CODIS or with the state police's known suspect comparison samples. So once they received that, it was about a 12-week process for them to create that DNA profile. They uploaded it to the two databases that comply with law enforcement requests, and then they were able to locate a single hit within the DNA genealogy sites that came back to a living uncle of the suspect, and then they were able to build a family tree from that uncle to where we are today.
And can you kind of talk about how important that police work was back in the early 80s when DNA was still fresh to
Right.
police work?
So DNA in 1983, there was no CODIS, there was no, I believe they call it STR, single tandem repeat analysis between a known offender and a sample. So at the time, they just did blood typing. And that's all we have for lab reports back in '83. And then as things progressed into the 90s, they got into the STR profiles, and then ultimately when CODIS was created, that sample went into CODIS. And it had been searched in CODIS for about 2 decades, with no results whatsoever. And it's still in CODIS today.
Can you talk a little bit about the criminal record that the killer had and his contact with this other woman?
Yes, so we know that in 1973 was his first contact. That contact occurred with Livonia Police Department, and that was for a breaking and entering complaint. I don't know the circumstances of it. Records are a bit sketchy going back that far. In 1977, he was arrested by Livonia Police Department on a drug possession charge. In 1981, he was arrested by the Fowlerville Police Department in Livingston County for the attempted abduction of a woman at the McDonald's parking lot. That was later found guilty, and he did serve some time in our jail. And then in 1982, he was arrested for larceny of women's shoes from Kmart in Livonia.
Is there any way to see if he's responsible for other murders, other acts of this nature?
So that's our hope of this today, is getting the information out there, his name, and getting whatever we have available to any other law enforcement agency that can use it to try to relate any unsolved cold case homicides that they may have.
As a cold case unit, how many unsolved cases do you have now, and how many of those are you applying this DNA genealogy test to?
Well, this is the first one we've used the DNA genealogy. We do have a number of other cold cases, including Paige Rinkowski. We have one from 1966, a homicide of Barbara Davis. The Michael Painter case from 1975 we still have. So we constantly evaluate the evidence to see if we can use this process now. This is all fairly new to us, so was a good test run to see how it worked in the cold cases.
I appreciate you can't speculate in this way, but I'm going to ask it in a ham-handed way. I mean, the odds of somebody doing this in a singular event, I'm assuming, are probably remote. Thus, how much hope might you have? How much interest might you have in regard to these other cases and the possibility that he's a multiple-time offender in this fashion?
Well, I know these guys here do it more than I do. I'm just kind of involved once a week with them. But they constantly network with other cold case investigators, state police cold case team, other sheriff's department cold case teams. So our information, it will be readily available to any law enforcement agency that needs it. We have put this out already to some of the other law enforcement agencies to see if they've got anything. Where they take it, it's up to them at this point, but there's nothing that we could really say right now.
Can you describe the Castiglione family's reaction to getting this information?
When we met with Christina's sister, she was all smiles. She was very happy and appreciative of the work that we had done. It was definitely a surprise. I don't think she was expecting to hear that news from us.
Would you say they had given up hope of ever having this solved?
I don't know if that would be the case. These guys have been in contact with the family over the years countless times, and we've updated them as the case has progressed throughout the years. So they knew that it was actively being worked.
Did you consult other police departments, like Fort Wayne, Indiana Police Department, that has used this technology, and before you guys jumped ahead in going into this?
The first person that I spoke to kind of get an idea as to how this worked was a detective from St. Clair County who was using the technology on a Jane Doe case that he was investigating. And then things just kind of snowballed from there. We got in touch with Season of Justice, and then ultimately the state police had a number of crime labs that do this genealogy testing that they put us in touch with, and we chose Oathram as our source.
Can you discuss the sentence that you received in, I was it 71 or 75 with the original attempted abduction? And what was his prison time, if there was any?
So the best I can tell from the records back then is it was pled down to an aggravated assault, and he received about a 2-week jail sentence in our jail and then probation.
Maybe this is a question for Sheriff Murphy. What would that be now? I mean, was that a typical?
I would think that would be a little bit light back then, frankly, not being familiar with the circumstances, but the judges have sentencing guidelines that they have to go by, so off the top of my head, I wouldn't know that, but when the judges sentence folks, they look at past criminal history and probation. Parole does what's called a PSI report, pre-sentence investigation, to kind of set those parameters. Seems a little bit light for an aggravated assault, right? 2 weeks, just my opinion, but.
Sheriff, what is your reaction to all of this? What are your thoughts about the process, the people, the resolution?
Yeah, so, you know, when we started the cold case, well, again, then Sheriff Bazat started it, and then it's continued. You know, to watch these guys come in, you know, once, twice, 3 times a week on their own dime, to go out and interview and follow up on investigations on their own dime, pretty amazing. I'll go off script a little bit here and say, you know, some of my paid guys don't have the dedication that these guys do, frankly. So, you know, hats off to them. And, you know, the hope too is that we end up solving some other ones. You know, they're not giving up. We're not done. There are other cold cases out there, as you know, as we already discussed. But yeah, couldn't be happier with the work that was done for sure.
Mr. Lenahan?
Yes, sir.
Can you just talk about, you know, working this cold case team for all these years, all the times you come in, you look at the same evidence over and over and over again, don't get a result, there's no resolution, and then something like this comes along where you have finally identified it. I mean, that's got to be gratifying.
It is, very gratifying.
Yeah. So for the team, I mean, and I know that this was asked somewhat earlier, but I mean, if you can elaborate a little bit about the motivation to come in and do this day after day.
Well, most of us have been in the business for a while, and we have dealt with a lot of the families, and they deserve something to be done. A lot of the things that happen are, and especially in not only this case, but other cases, they go through detectives that have, you know, a lot of things to do. This is not their priority. With us, it's a priority. And if we can resolve these things, then we will.
Was this a case you thought, one day we're gonna solve this?
I did. I grew up in Redford, and I have a special, something for Redford. I knew the area really well. In fact, I knew some of the people that were interviewed at the time that it happened, and it helped to put some things together. And, you know, I think that the more that we have cold case teams that are strictly working cold cases, there's going to be more solved.
If I can ask a quick follow-up on the DNA. And forgive my ignorance on this, and I don't mean to ask it in a disrespectful way, but the why now element, I mean, it's in the police database, because I ask out of my own ignorance. What takes the time to 2022 to put it into the genealogy database, the why now aspect, but also I'm interested in the uncle that it traced back to.
Mm-hmm.
Does he live locally? And then once you find out that person, how do you end up with your suspect, if you can lay personize that, if you will?
So the why now part, I can't say, probably cost prohibitive a little bit in the past. This process maybe 10, 15 years ago could have been a $100,000 process. It's significantly come down, and then with help from grant funding through Season of Justice, we were able to make it a reality without any delay. They were great to work with. So that, I mean, that's probably the why now. And I'm sorry, the second part of your question?
The uncle.
So the
Does he
uncle-
live
yeah, the uncle
locally?
is
And you
local.
Find out him, and then how long does it take, how do you go about, who's in the family, who traces back to this DNA?
So the uncle is local. We did learn that based on the profile of the suspect of Charles Shaw, that it was likely a nephew of the uncle that shared the same chromosome. So there were some other nephews that were through a sister to the uncle that wouldn't have matched. So it brought us down to two possibilities. So we sought out a living brother and a living son of the suspect and obtained target samples from the two of them. Those target samples were also analyzed by Othram, and they came back with a 100% match as brother-brother and father-son relationship.
Are you able to share how those family members reacted?
I can tell you the ex-wife, she believed that something like this could have happened at some point during their marriage. She wasn't overly surprised, but she was more than helpful in bringing this to resolution. The brother was a bit blown away. He had no idea. The majority of, he was a little bit older than Charles Shaw, so he was in the military when a lot of this was going on in Charles' life. So he wasn't around to witness all of it firsthand.
Thank you.
Is it not the case that
Can
normally?
I,
go
let
ahead.
me just step in for a half a second. To answer your question a little bit more on the DNA, yeah, on the DNA. So, as was mentioned earlier, the DNA was uploaded into CODIS, which is a law enforcement database. If we have DNA today from a sexual assault or there's blood somewhere, we send that off to the state police. They're going to match that in CODIS if there's a match. They don't do the genealogy end of it. So even though we had DNA, we could have sent that to the state police lab and they would have said, yes, it's this unknown person that we've already got identified in CODIS, but we don't have a name to attach it to. That's the importance of the genealogy and that the private sector does.
Elaborate on that if you would, meaning CODIS is obviously if anybody's committed a felony and their DNA is taken,
So,
or criminal, but I guess my point is with budgets and realistic funding of how you staff a department and research and timing versus how this could help law enforcement if there is a way to fund this on a broader scale. I'd be interested in your opinion on that.
well, so the technology, as Sergeant Young mentioned, the dollar amount has come down significantly, so funding really shouldn't be an issue. But going back to this particular case, in a perfect world, because of Mr. Shaw's criminal history or past criminal history, remember, he died about 8 months after Christina was found. Normal criminals don't just stop their behavior, right? So the evidence gets uploaded into CODIS, the DNA gets uploaded into CODIS, he continues his life of crime, and at some point, the aha goes, hey, wait a minute, here's your guy from 1983, right? So.
Detective, could I just ask about the uncle? Was his DNA in a system? In other words, did he have a criminal record, or was he, did
No,
he go
this
to
was-
those public sites?
This was through a public site. So there's two public sites that cooperate with law enforcement, and that's GEDmatch, GED Match, and Family Tree DNA. And when you upload your DNA profile for genealogy purposes to those sites, they have waivers that say, yes, I agree to have my DNA checked against law enforcement submissions only for reasons of sexual assault and homicide, or a Jane John Doe case. So those are really the only cases that law enforcement's allowed to search against in the public sites.
And so, frankly, it was that gave you the opportunity to match.
It was his family tree that he already had on the site, and that we had a suspect that we could relate it to.
I guess maybe to either of you, so in terms of providing, I mean, you had to go to these organizations to get this funding, which they provided, and that's great. Does there need to be explicit state, federal funding that is simply providing this so that all these cases, I mean, this case took this long and money was an impediment, not the impediment, but it was an impediment. How do we get that?
It obviously helps. They have a limited budget as well, so when we submitted our application for grant approval, I believe that there was 6 other cases nationwide that were approved. We were the first in Michigan to receive funding from Season of Justice. And then if you research Othram Laboratories, they also have a site called DNA Solves where they highlight the cases that they solve on a weekly basis, and it seems like they're just constantly rolling in. It's what they do, it's their bread and butter, and they did a great job with it, and they were great to work with.
But with this technology, should there be, like, explicit, I mean, ironically, was not Sheriff Bazat the original detective on the case? Yes, he's now a state representative. So is this something that you might follow up with him to say, maybe this is something that the state should be looking at funding explicitly?
Yeah, so I think there needs to be, my opinion on that would be, once everything else has ran its course, right? Because if you remember, there was, in part of Season of Justice, the reason that they will offer grant funding is all of the police work has to be done before they're going to do the DNA testing, right? And in this particular case, that's exactly what happened. So I would very much be in favor of funding being available for that. But at the end of the day, you still got to do the boots on the ground. You still got to do the police work. And frankly, I'll just speak for our county, especially now. I know that should we have a case in the future, the board would fund that. There's no question about that. I mean, we bring closure to a 40-year-old homicide. That's a pretty big deal.
And can you kind of talk about that aspect of how, like, using this genealogical DNA will help you guys solve crimes in the future?
Well, it has to be collected from the past, right? And fortunately, in this particular case, it was collected in 1983. Nobody had a crystal ball to know what that was going to look like 40 years later. The deputies, detectives on the scene could have very easily overlooked things, and we not had the DNA at that particular time, and we wouldn't be here, we wouldn't be here today. So there has to be, the scene has to be processed originally, properly, and then going forward for 40 years, that has to be preserved properly as well, right? So there's a lot of things in this particular case, and frankly, all cold cases, that just have to work out perfectly for that to happen.
To be clear, the DNA matched the uncle. There was no DNA available for Mr. Shaw, correct?
That's the DNA that was in CODIS.
Okay, my bad, thank you.
Well, good?
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. I apologize. When we decided to pick this date 2 weeks ago, we weren't on an impending ice-ageddon. So,
Can I get your name,
you
sir?
bet.
Nice to meet you. You too. How about Detective Sergeant over here, or Detective Moore? I'm good. I'm just a reporter. I'm Ken. Okay. I was trying to get you to give yourself a pat on the back, and you wouldn't bite. Only Detective, just want to make sure we get your name right. It's hang on, let me get my Okay, you're with Livingston County. Thank you very much. I'm sure Bill might have his own. And your name, sir?
William,
No, sir.
That's me. Oh, I'm sorry. No, you're fine. I apologize.
You were back at the Highland, you were here.
Just the spelling of your name, please.
I'm Detective. Okay, good. All right.
Is your name in this? We're late to the game.
It is, no.
Can I get that?
Sure.
Sorry, we just thought about this.
Title's Detective Sergeant, M-A-T-T, Y-O-U-N-G, Manuel.
One more time.
M-A-T-T-Y-O-U-N-G.
Your name, sir?
And
You are?
Bob
Judgment.
Y-O-U-N-G.
With Livingston County
So you guys basically put your own time in to crack this case wide open.
All right, and 40 years later, they do have a suspect in the death of Christine Castiglione. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. Unfortunately, the suspect died 8 months after Christine's body was found. We're going to have more on this as our Cody Butler was there at the press conference asking several questions about how the department came to this finding and how they're going to use it moving forward. Coming up, starting with First at 5, our 90 minutes of news. We hope to see you then. Thanks for tuning in.